what I want folks to do is understand that there's something they can do. What they are seeing isn't a natural phenomenon. What they're seeing is a human-caused catastrophe. And if humans caused it, then humans can uncause it. And we just need enough humans to believe in themselves to do that.
Hey everyone, and welcome to your Daily Detroit. It's Friday, September 13th, 2024. I am Jer Stays, and today, a feature conversation. Joining me on the line is artist Xavier Cortada. He's going to be coming to town very soon as part of the Arthur L. Johnson Urban Perspectives Lecture Series on September 18th, coming to Wayne State University. I'll put a link in the show notes, but Xavier is an artist, does a lot of interesting stuff. And when I was prepping for this interview, you do something that as a informational host or entertainer, that you do something that I cannot do. And that is the ability to talk about climate change in a way that resonates with people who aren't already signed up to the idea of climate change. And you do it through art. And so I want to unpack this a little bit and talk to you about, like, how did you come to bring together your great skills with art and talking about like a social issue like that? Because, you know, my dad was an artist and he always told me, you know, the worst thing you could say about his art was that it was nice. He'd rather that you felt something, that you loved it or you hated it or whatever. And you definitely make people feel something about your art.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for taking time to talk to me and to share, my ideas with your viewers. And I hope that by the end of this podcast, you will believe that you actually do use your voice and your creativity to let people better understand the vulnerability that we're all facing, but more importantly, the ability that we all have to do something about it. And I also appreciate the fact that your dad was an artist, and I'm of that mindset that art has a job to do. And if it doesn't trigger some sort of emotional drive in you, then it's not doing its job. And I think I try to do that with my art.
How did you come upon bringing art and climate change together, and art and social issues?
So I think it's a long, long journey. And part of what I want to share with the students and the broader community, actually, it's open to the entire community at Wayne State, is that it's all a process. We are all creative beings, and that the experiences that we feel, that we go through, that we surmount, shape us and shape our way of thinking. And that response to those experiences can happen in a creative way, in a problem-solving way. Before I was an artist tackling climate, I was an artist tackling social justice issues. And before I was an artist tackling social justice issues, I was just like you, watching my dad paint.
So what about his art shaped you and your outlook on life?
The kind of painting and the kind of work that my dad did was particularly insightful and relevant to my career as an artist. See, my dad came from Cuba as a young man. He was 21 years old. He was a Cuban refugee. This was back in 1962. He and my mom met in Miami and had to get jobs up in New York. So I was born in Albany, New York. By 1967, I wasn't even 3 years old yet. I was in Miami, and I've lived in Miami ever since. Our family in Miami didn't know in 1967, 68, 69, whether or not they'd go back to Cuba. They didn't know if Cuba would be free. And my dad and his older brother, my uncle, were artists. So they would paint. And I remember in the early 70s, they would convene other refugees, other exiles, other people trying to figure out what to do with their lives, and more importantly, how to welcome other immigrants, other exiles who were coming into the community. And the place where they did that were in artistic spaces in their little gallery. I remember as a young boy that art wasn't about selling something or getting a ribbon on something or winning something. Art was about building something, building community. And that's what happened there. There were these rooms with artists and poets, and they would all be talking about Cuba, about what they lost, about what they would do. So to me, from a very, very young age, art did more than make you feel something. Art kind of made you do something, right? And I think that through time, as I grew up now in Miami of the 80s, and if you saw Scarface or Miami Vice, that's a little exaggerated. But the truth is that, I grew up in a city with an incredible amount of violence. We had the drug wars, the cocaine cowboys. We had these horrible race riots while I was in high school. And I experienced all that as a very young man. And I think the second sort of pillar of this socially engaged art is one that art is more than just creating beautiful things. And two is that when you see a problem, you lean in. You don't run away from it. You try to figure it out and try to solve it. And I did that as a very young man, volunteering. And by the time I got out of law school, Miami was still having its issues. So I started a drug rehab center. And I started working with my community to tackle and address the scourge of drugs and violence in our communities. In that process, I found bringing people together to talk about the issue was really the solution. Having everyone feel like they have a voice, finding ways of amplifying that voice worked. So early on in dealing with violence and gang issues in Miami, I chaired the city's gang task force back then. I started bringing people together by creating murals and artistic platforms that amplified their voices. And that led me on this trajectory that eventually had me focus on really the largest social justice issue. In fact, the existential issue of our time, and that is how we allow our leaders to incentivize companies through our tax dollars to do incredible damage to us and to everything that lives on this planet by allowing fossil fuels to get tax benefits as opposed to pivoting and finding a cleaner way of living our lives in a more equitable way of facing this climate challenge. So just like I did as a young man when I saw a problem, I used my creativity and my can-do spirit to try to tackle it in my small space in the world. I believe that each and every one of us has the ability to do that and to tackle this crazy issue of our time, which is climate.
You mentioned about subsidy, and I know we're talking about art, but there is a fact that it's about the choices of subsidies we make. I think there is a popular perception that it is the hand of the market that is the only factor when it comes to which kinds of fuels that we use for our vehicles, for our homes, all this stuff. And it's all subsidies all the way down on both sides. Whether you see the complaints about subsidies for green, but if we're having an honest conversation about this, our prices for fuel in America would be so much higher if we didn't have a ton of subsidies on the fossil fuel side. And it's interesting that you hit on that.
I've been at those United Nations meetings, right? The Conference of the Parties meetings, the big climate change meetings that happen. And the lobby interests of the fossil fuel interest have a big thumb on what happens in the U.S. Senate. And I'm in Kentucky. There's a particular senator from Kentucky, right, the minority leader, who has tried to stall movement. But there are nations and nation states all over this world who are beholden to the interests of the fossil fuel industry. And that is on both sides of the aisle, up and down the halls of Congress.
In your mind, how do you tie art to climate change?
A lot of the art that I try to do is about having us understand these issues and the complexity and the structural deficiencies in our government so that we can begin to tackle them. And you don't do that by preaching. You don't do that by admonishing. I think you do that by inviting people into a conversation. And you do that by piquing their curiosity. And that's what my art tries to do. I'm not going to win you immediately by just giving you statistics. Those are essential. In fact, I use those statistics to craft my creative approaches. But to get you to care and to understand, you have to feel before you think. And art makes you feel. It's what your dad told you. You wanted to feel something. And I want you to feel that the problem that we're talking about impacts you personally, it impacts your wallet. I mean, I want you to empathize. I want you to care about your neighbor. I really do. I want you to be a loving, citizen. I want all of us to do that. I want you to care about animals that you co-evolved with and animals halfway across the world. I want you to do that. But guess what? I don't need you to start thinking that way if you already do. That's not my target audience. My target audience are those folks who feel disconnected from it all and are trying to take care of their daily issue. If I can make the global personal, if I can have you feel that you're part of a global problem, but more importantly, that you can solve it, then just like being in a violence-torn community, instead of, trying to hide from the bullets, you can help heal the gunshot wounds. You can feel like you're part of the solution. And when it comes to climate, there are lots of things that we almost perambulating at night or blindfolded do at the ballot box to give people power to poison our rivers, to give people power to poison our atmosphere, to give people power to destroy our economy, our future, by not understanding what we're doing. So if there's a connection, if you can see how subsidizing ExxonMobil to continue doing what it does harms the economic opportunity of your grandchild and the lungs of your grandchild and the health of your grandchild, because they're going to live on a planet that is hot and economic disarray, then maybe you'll start voting people into office who can put more demands on what a corporation can do insofar as it pollutes our planet. And that kind of oversight that people hate to hear, the word regulation, is essential, because regulation is what keeps your river clean. Regulation is what keeps your air clean. It's what keeps you healthy. It's what keeps the food that you eat on your table not having bacteria in it. That's what regulations do. And subsidies, in many ways, keep the competition down. It allows you to continue your path. And what you do is you just buy off, legally, but you buy off the public policymakers. The only way that you can stop a corporation, because a corporation has an infinite amount of greenwashing marketing dollars. They can make you feel that they're doing the right thing or doing it in the right time, but none of them are doing it with the urgency that we need to stop the catastrophe that's happening to our planet.
So how do regular people hold companies accountable? I think a lot of people feel like this is a David and Goliath situation.
Citizens, through the power of their voice, can regulate what these corporations do, then what we call the externalities of business, the way they make money but aren't taxed for cleaning up the pollution they create, those things that are not reflected in the profit that the shareholders make but are penalized by the population at large. And society can start making things a little bit more just and more equitable. And that's what climate justice is about. It's about making the polluters pay. It's about assuming that all of us have to be treated with dignity and equally, that all of us have a right to a healthy future. The horror of our climate crisis is that those with less will suffer more, and they will suffer first. And we have seen this time and time again. We saw it during the pandemic, right? The climate will bring more pandemics because the vectors of disease will come to latitudes up north. The diseases used to be given by insects that were trapped in the tropics, but as the tropics creep northward with the latitudes, as climate changes and our communities become warmer and warmer, those insects, the vectors of disease, will impact us more and more. And we saw during our last pandemic that the first responders, the frontline workers, the people who have to clock in and out of work, not the ones who could work and Zoom from home, are the ones who suffered most. And climate will continue to bring this kind of catastrophic impact on our lives, whether it's through flooding or dangerous heat days or wildfires. I think that that's the calamity that we're facing now. I don't think there's a sense of urgency to this problem, but I do have hope, Jared. As a young man, I saw problems and wasn't paralyzed by them. I tried to find solutions. And I see in our youth today an incredible can-do willingness. I mean, there is climate anxiety, but there's also an incredible can-do willingness to tackle and try to change systems. And that's why I'm so excited about coming to Wayne State University to speak with those students, to let them know what I've seen and what I've done, and share a little bit of wisdom with them that hopefully can be part of their toolkit as they face the challenges of our time.
What's something in your journey that you thought you knew but learned different over the last, say, few years of this social justice work?
The climate thing. I told you a lot about my earlier career. I left out some really important parts about traveling across Latin America, doing a lot of speaking with our U.S. embassies. I remember being in a place in Tegucigalpa in Honduras, and there were these comunas or hillside towns, and there was this issue with, juvenile violence. A lot of the precursor to a lot of the gangs that we see, were sort of happening in the early 90s. And I remember meeting with parents in this community and talking about their juvenile justice issue. And we started talking a little bit about how water in the community wasn't as accessible because the guy with a water truck would be getting mugged on the way up the hill. And I wanted to reframe the issue for them and said, let's not make this about juvenile justice. Let's make this about access to water. Those kids that are preventing the water truck from coming up here can be kids that you care about and helping address the issue. Then let everyone sort of coalesce around the water problem as opposed to the violence problem. So one thing I think I have seen along the way is the importance of reframing the issue. And I think this is what in the climate movement we have seen as the intersectionality. You can't talk about climate unless you also talk about all the other social justice issues that are at the table. Climate, I think, had been seen primarily as a conservation issue, as an environmental issue that had to do with more white and wealthy communities. And as I just told you a second ago, climate impacts Black and brown people, people of color more. It impacts people who live in communities that have historically been dismissed as places where pollution can happen, where corporations can get away with things that they wouldn't be able to get away in other neighborhoods. And I think that our ability to understand and to bring this conversation as a justice conversation, as opposed to a scientific conversation, I think is one of the pivotal and important components of this movement. And in a global way, you see this happening. There are neighborhoods, the South Pacific, that are more prone to the violence of climate. Those islands will disappear, and all the memory and history and culture of those nations and the people who live in those small Pacific islands that are 6-7 feet above sea level will disappear by the end of the century if we continue doing what we do now. If we don't stop pollution, if we continue to subsidize fossil fuels, if we elect people who get rid of things like the Paris talks, like the last administration did, then we are going to see not 7 feet of sea level rise, but perhaps even more. Because, of course, the more carbon, more pollution we put in the atmosphere, the more heat gets trapped. And, of course, that causes our poles to melt. The ice in Antarctica melts and raises sea levels. The ice in the Arctic melts and allows the heat to penetrate the oceans, which continue to add heat. And before you know it, you have this crazy sort of climate where it's unpredictable. You have Texas freezing when it's not supposed to freeze, and Alaska melting when it's never happened. And before you know it, you have wildfires because all these climate and weather patterns have changed. So that extreme weather and the rising seas and the disruption to economies and to nation states and the mass climate migration that it will bring is the stuff of famine, the stuff of the death of billions of people and the destructions of ecosystems that everywhere where land touches water and where drought dries life. So that's the calamity that we're facing. And, of course, if you're facing that, you'd rather ignore it. You'd rather say, I'll be dead by then. You'd rather say, that's someone else's problem. You'd rather say, there's nothing I can do. You'd rather say, technology will solve it. You'd rather kick the can down the road.
This is heavy stuff. How do you keep people from going full ostrich and just putting their heads in the sand on this stuff?
I mean, it's easier to ignore something as catastrophic as that than face it. But I believe that it impacts you during your life. I believe that working together and learning together, we can tap into our creativity to find new ways of communicating this complexity, making that complexity personal to your neighbor, inspiring your neighbor to care about it, and together coming up with solutions that your public policy officials can implement initially in a scale that a city commission is going to want to take, maybe with a 3-2 vote, but still want to take, and eventually in ways that bigger legislative bodies can do to change the way systems work and hopefully get the kind of win that will be the straw that breaks the camel's back and creates a kind of movement. climate has been moving up and up as the thing that voters care about. In the past, it was completely absent. But as people see wildfires destroying their homes, as people cough up when they see the impacts of the wildfire smoke in their lungs, as people begin to understand that the seasons aren't the way they used to be, they respond. And I think that's what's happening now.
So how can people get involved?
What I want folks to do is understand that there's something they can do. What they are seeing isn't a natural phenomenon. What they're seeing is a human-caused catastrophe. And if humans caused it, then humans can uncause it. And we just need enough humans to believe in themselves to do that. And art, the stuff of my dad and your dad, is a very powerful gift that our ancestors have given us since we walked out of Africa, 60,000 years ago and decided to populate not just that continent, but every other continent on this planet. Art has been the vehicle that we use to communicate ideas, to build civilizations, to create culture and language and society. And I think art, not as a commodity, not as a thing you bid on eBay, not as a thing that you buy at a gallery shop, but art as this beautiful vehicle for expression can help show us the way, because it disarms us, it helps us imagine differently, it helps us reframe the way we think, it convenes us, it brings us into a conversation where all of us feel like we belong. And if we feel that we belong in this conversation, then that hopefully will be a platform for us to find creative approaches, creative ways of solving the situation that we're in. And I know we can do that because every day we do that with our lives. We create our lives, we create our families, we create our jobs, we create our paths, we create our day. Like literally we are creative beings. We have a mindset as to what we want to happen and we do it. Some of us sort of give up along the way and need a little bit more motivation and inspiration. And that's where part of what we can create is a path for others that we love to come on board and be part of that journey. But each of us are absolutely spectacular creative beings. In a way, I think it becomes really obvious to today's generation just by the creativity they do when they marry it with technology, right? You can actually feel and see the creativity in each of us. And it doesn't have to be limited to the obvious things like song and painting and dancing and drawing. I think creativity can just be the way you think, the way you are, the way you walk through life. And if we can just believe in ourselves enough to create a better world, we will.
I understand that, and I hear that completely. Xavier Cortada will lead the discussion on creativity, courage, and justice, championing and innovative climate solutions through art. That is September 18th from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. at the Bernath Auditorium as part of the Arthur L. Johnson Urban Perspectives Lecture Series. I will drop a link in the show notes to that and to, of course, your work, Xavier, and I appreciate your time on Daily Detroit. I really appreciate you.
It's been so wonderful being here with you. Thanks so much.
And we are done for today and the week. Thank you so much to our members on Patreon, patreon.com/Daily Detroit. I really appreciate you. Thank you to Cheyenne Noserini, who is editing these episodes, as well as everyone else behind the scenes. And I just really appreciate you. This has been a big week, getting to over 1,500 episodes. We will be back at it again real soon. I'm Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and I'll see you around Detroit.